Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one of the painful realities that we have to make sense of that's happening across the world right now is declining assistance to the most poor and vulnerable of the world. And especially the US portion of that under the Trump administration is getting cut drastically. So this raises the question, how should Christians respond in this era of lower government aid to the poor and vulnerable? And to help address this question, I am so glad to have two friends of mine, Dana and Bill Wichterman. Dana Wichterman worked at USAID for 15 years before moving into a variety of leadership roles. And Bill Wichterman served as special assistant to President George W. Bush, and before serving the White House, served in a number of senior staff positions on Capitol Hill. So both Dana and Bill understand the importance of government efforts to help the most vulnerable in the world, but they also have a strong vision for how Christians themselves can step into the gap. And they've recently published a book about Christian philanthropy entitled Stewards, Not Owners, The Joy of Aligning Your Money with Your Faith. Dana and Bill, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks, Curtis. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah.
Dana, I want to start with you, since you worked at USAID, and as Elon Musk said, he was trying to feed USAID to the wood chipper. Recently, there was a court order blocking that move, and then another court order. So it's unclear what's going to happen. But I think it's probably fair to say if the Trump administration is deeply committed to eliminating USAID, it probably one way or another is going to get its way. So fill out the picture for us of what that means. As someone who worked at USAID for a long time, what does the elimination of USAID mean for the world's most vulnerable populations?
Yeah. So the thing was, this was so sudden, so chaotic, and also presented in such a demeaning way that it really was hard to make sense of. So you've got a lot of people, Christians and non-Christians, within the sector, development sector, that are just so confused. And it's still hard to make sense of because, as you said, there's lawsuits. They've been promising that maybe it won't be under USAID, but they'll move it to State Department. We've had groups be frozen and then unfrozen and then frozen again. So I think right now there's still a lot of chaos, and we're not sure how this is all going to fall out. But a couple things we can be sure of. I think USAID will not exist under that name. It will be drawn under the State Department. It has been under the State Department before, so this is not a new thing. So I think that is still something that could still work fine. However, all the cuts to the contractors and the NGOs and all the mechanisms for payment have just been completely obliterated. So even those, the work that they want to see continued, that Rubio from State Department says he wants to see continued, because of those payment mechanisms being cut off, the whole system has kind of fallen apart. So you're seeing people, medical, humanitarian, conflict zones, refugees, all hurting around the globe because they operate in so many countries.
Can you say a little bit more about kind of what USAID though represents in the kind of the lives of the poor and vulnerable themselves? Like, what is USAID doing that makes the life of the poor that we ought to be caring about like so much more vulnerable?
Yeah. So USAID has operated in many different sectors. In fact, multiple sectors that the poor and vulnerable live in. So, for example, they do a lot of foreign food assistance, maternal health, pretty much any sector that you can think of that the poor and vulnerable live in, and those who are oppressed, the unjust. So we do things, for example, in criminal justice reform, anti-corruption around the world, improving businesses so that people can get out of poverty, and agricultural reform. I would say that USAID has kind of had some mission drift over the years. We've tried to be everything for everyone, and that may not have been in all of the U.S. interests. So there's certainly things that anyone can talk about fairly and say there were things that maybe we should roll back. But the idea that we would have been the largest foreign aid donor in the world for, decades, and now we completely dropped that, whatever, almost $65 million in aid was frozen at first. I have heard recently that only 34% of that dollar amount will be completely gone away with. So I have heard that it may look better in the future than we thought in terms of programs, humanitarian programs coming back online.
But nevertheless, that's still a massive drop and a huge disruption to millions of people who have depended on these services. Bill, I want to talk to you about what you really have worked on in your government career, which is when you were on the staff of former senior majority leader Bill Frist, who is a committed Christian, and when you were a special assistant to George W. Bush. Both Frist and Bush really led the way on what I think was a signal policy achievement in the U.S., but especially among Christians trying to influence government policy, and that was the passage of PEPFAR, which was the president's program to address the AIDS crisis in Africa. It is, I think, the public health policy of America that has saved the most lives in history, and and the fact that Christians sort of led the way in passing it, I think, is a great witness and testimony. Well, Bill, tell me, what's the current status of PEPFAR?
Unclear, Curtis. Like many things right now, it's a fluid situation in Washington. And so there have been reports of aid being cut off, and then others where it has been resumed, either by executive branch dictate or by judicial dictate. So I would say right now it's at least uncertain, and it has an uncertain future, along with all foreign aid. There's really been a movement away from foreign aid, not just in the US, less publicized as what Europe is doing right now. Even the UK, for instance, under a Labour government, is moving their foreign aid increasingly over to defense as NATO becomes less of a certainty for European countries. So it seems, and it's hard to predict the future, but the whole foreign aid establishment of the last 60 years is very much endowed all throughout Western civilization. That really, to what extent there'll be formal governmental aid at any kinds of the levels that we've been seeing, I think is very much in question.
So it seems like we're moving into a new era where we cannot depend on government, at least the ways that it has in the past, to care about the most poor and vulnerable. And as a Christ follower, then this raises the question, okay, what do we do? How do we respond to it? And it raises the possibility that as Christians, we need to step into the gap, that we're moving into a new era where government is retreating from that role. And perhaps Christians then need to at least step into it, and maybe can't fill it, but at least need to step into it. So let's get practical about that, because I've had that sense that that's kind of the era that we're moving in. My wife and I are both deeply concerned and feel like we should be doing something as Christ followers. But I have to say that both my wife and I feel like, well, how do we get started? I mean, because the change has been so drastic, and because there isn't this sort of like ramp up to it, it's just like, it feels overwhelming. And most people, when they're overwhelmed, they kind of shut down, or they kind of don't deal with it. So Dana, I want to ask you, give my wife and me some advice. How do we not just shut down in the midst of this drastic change? How do we get started, at least, in being the kind of Christ follower that steps into the gap, even if the government is no longer going to be there?
Great question. So I think what I'm seeing is Christians are not, even though they're not organized into one place, they are starting to coalesce and come together and think through how to step into this gap. The National Christian Foundation, which is one of the largest donor advised funds in the world, has 30,000 givers, has given to 36,000 ministries over the years. And in 2024, Christians gave away $2.6 billion to ministries around the globe. There's another group called Trust Bridge Global. And in 2024, their givers, that's another donor advised fund, gave away $3 billion to charities in 74 different countries. There's also a group called The Gathering of Christians in Philanthropy that are also trying to coalesce together and think through, how can we do this? How can we step into that gap, find out which ministries are hurting and need support? So we may not be giving money directly to government anymore, but we need to think through, how can we then find the local charities that are already on the ground and know what the needs are of the local population and try to fill in some of those needs. And the good news is giving money to local charities usually is a lot less expensive. And so Trust Bridge Global can help you do that, kind of give and bypass a government or even a international NGO, can go right to the local NGO. But what I would say is, we as Christians need to reject the idea that the Trump administration has kind of painted all international non-governmental organizations and even local private voluntary organizations as corrupt and on the take. That is not true. And so we need to urge our authorities to speak the truth, that yes, in any sector, there's going to be corruption and need for change and reform. But there are many good nonprofits where people are missionally oriented, giving of their lives, walking into very dangerous situations and trying to help the least of these around the world. So what I would really urge people is not to decide that all the nonprofit sector is corrupt. That is absolutely not true. And what I would encourage you and your wife to do is try to go to some of those organizations that have pre-vetted some of these groups and determine where God has you in terms of filling that gap, whether it be poverty alleviation, or work with International Justice Mission to help release those in human trafficking, et cetera. But right now, there is no organized fund by Christians to think through to do this together. Hopefully that will come about.
But Dana, thank you so much for giving us some practical tips. We'll put some of the links in the show notes if you want to look at some of these organizations that do this screening. I really love your point, Dana, about role modeling continued confidence and faith in the organizations that are doing good work, that as we continue to give in that, we are sort of role modeling and embodying the narrative that there are good organizations doing work out there. Bill, I want to talk to you, and I want to ask you to help us pastorally think about stepping into this gap. So one of the things that Dana pointed out is rejecting the false narrative that all NGOs are ineffective or corrupt, that absolutely should be rejected. I think there's another one, though, that is dealing with hope, that it can feel like things are so just hopeless, especially with the US government and other governments pulling back. It can just feel like I'm just going to be dropping $1 into an ocean of need, and it's all hopeless. And, hopelessness is another thing that I think suppresses philanthropy, because, why even try? Why give your money if it's not going to make a difference? I want you to speak to that, Bill, because you've always struck to me as a perpetually hope-filled guy. So connect hope to giving in this moment. How do we actually draw on, develop, and deepen our hope as givers?
Yeah. So good question. And it is easy when you go and look at the world's needs to feel like you're spitting in the ocean and feel like, what difference does it make? I think this is why it goes to the question, though, of whether or not we're stewards, or whether or not this is our money. If we're stewards, the question is, what does the master want us to do with his money? And generosity is at the heart of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Generosity was about the Lord laying down his life at the request of the Father on behalf of us sinners. And so we're called to model what it means to be God followers by doing that. And generosity is not an optional thing for Christ followers, but I would argue integral to what it means to follow the Lord. In First Peter, Peter writes about how we have been given gifts so that we can serve others. And Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 9 about how, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And so I think those notions of stewardship, which are so integral and woven throughout Scripture, are the reason that we do it. And that's not to say that therefore effectiveness is beside the point. Nope, we're supposed to think about effectiveness for sure. But I do love the old story of the guy throwing starfish back into the ocean on the beach. And you're like, why are you doing that? There's thousands of starfish. What difference does it make? He said, it makes a difference to this starfish, as he tossed another one in. And so I think really there's joy that comes from making a difference. And if you just focus on what you can't do and pretend you're God and like, oh, I should, we're not. But when you focus on what you can do, one of the consistent themes of people in our community of givers that we're in is the joy that comes from it. Mm. You don't do it to get joy, but joy is such a pervasive byproduct. In the book that we wrote, Stewards, Not Owners, one of the things that was the consistent theme of the 24 stories that we captured of really modern day saints stewarding their money is how much joy people experience from that. And ask somebody who's been a recipient of that aid or investment. And we want to talk about that with you too, Curtis, about the role of investment and all this. And they're, of course, blessed by it. And think of how you have been blessed by somebody else's generosity in your life. So I think you have to, and this is where, by the way, Paul writes in Philippians, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, and admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy, think about such things. I think that it's a prime tool of the evil one is to discourage us. Yeah. And we have to keep our eyes on what we can do rather than what we can't do. Bono has said, from Bono of U2, he said that he sees his role as just tearing off little pieces of the darkness.
Mm. Bill, I love that because I think when it comes to money, we can slip into the mentality of just pure technical efficacy because money sort of teaches us like, well, what's worth it? What's valuable? What can you accomplish with this money? And it sounds like what you're saying is we've got to get out of the mindset of a technical efficiency model of money and into money as witness, money as testimony of God's character and our obedience and desire to image God's character. That's actually a very different sort of mentality. And we almost have to kind of purposefully switch on when we switch into our giving. Like, this is about witness. This is about reflecting God's character. This may or may not solve the problem in its entirety. Although obviously, like you said, we want to invest in things that are effective, but in the end, that's God's responsibility. So thank you for that word, Bill. Dana, what about you? What are other biblical truths that have been important for you as a philanthropist to really anchor on?
Yeah, well, let me first actually go back to the compassion fatigue and let me put it in historical context. Poverty in 1950, 60% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. By 2020, 9%. So we went from 60% of the global population living in extreme poverty to 9% in 2020. However, because the population has grown over that time, there are still 700 million people living in extreme poverty. So our role isn't done, our work isn't done, but I think we can be encouraged by the fact that poverty alleviation has been effective over the decades, and it can, there can be progress. And then I also think we want to think theologically of the past. Eric Ha, who was formerly with International Justice Mission, is now with another international, I think it's International Medical Organization. And he reminds us in a recent Time magazine article that Christians built the first hospitals, led abolitionist movements, pioneered global humanitarian work. It was in the slums of Calcutta that Mother Teresa, not a government agency, nursed the dying. And it's war-torn Sudan that it's missionary doctors, not diplomats, who are setting broken bones and treating malaria. So I think we need to remember, and even during the Black Plague, it was the Christians that were known to run in and help people who were dying. So I think it's, like you said, it's a part of our witness to run to those broken places and hurting places and try to alleviate suffering and produce flourishing. And so then when we think about generosity, I also want to say it is Christians, even though we do not give as we probably should. Christians on average give about 2.5% of their income to charities around the world. And it's practicing Christians that give more than just cultural Christians.
Yeah.
So if we moved even close to the 10% tithe, we could do an amazing amount of filling that gap that you talk about.
I think that's really encouraging, and I think the history of Christian philanthropy is important to tell. That Christians were, in many ways, the first philanthropists. The early church were the ones who especially built institutions that cared for the poor, orphanages, hospitals, like you said. And I think it was because they had such a deep sense that the kingdom was breaking in. That in Jesus' death and resurrection, the kingdom was coming on earth, not in its completeness, but it was breaking in. And so they, as representatives of the kingdom, were to be signposts, were to be witnesses. And that involved investing in institutions that were representing God's kingdom of care for the least of these. And this is why, as Christians today, if government is not going to do that, then certainly Christians, it is our role to be the pointers, to be the image bearers that point to the kingdom breaking into this world. Bill, I want to ask you that to talk about this book, because one of the strengths of the book, I think, is that you provide many stories of role models. You said earlier, I can't remember the number you said, but there are a lot of stories that you tell. Among all of the stories that you tell of different Christian givers, can you pick one that maybe is one of your favorites to share with our listeners?
Oh boy, that's tough. I'd say I'll go with John Porter. John Porter was headed to be working in charitable giving in Haiti. He was in college. He was a business major. He had gone to Haiti and was just struck by this place, just 90-minute flight from Miami, that was so desperately in need. And the Lord redirected him and said, I want you to go into business. And instead, he went to East Africa, Rwanda, and he set up a creamery called Masaka Farms, which provides protein, yogurt, dairy products to the people of Rwanda. 60% of his workforce is deaf. And the deaf in Rwanda are considered worthless, drags on society, drags on the economy. Here they get to learn sign language, they have a community, but they have dignified jobs at a for-profit company that is changing Rwanda. And he took his business skills, which was his gravitational pull, and he married that with his desire to help the poor. And that's a powerful story of making a difference. Masaka Farms goes to this day. Dan and I are investors in Masaka Farms. And I think that sometimes we think exclusively about the role of nonprofit charitable giving as the way to change the world. And part of what we cover in our book is the important role that for-profit business plays in changing the world. And we have a chart in the book which shows, it's a pie chart, and the slice of pie in there is less than 1%, and that's charitable giving in the US. And the rest of the pie is liquid investable assets in the US. As Christians, we spend a lot of time thinking about our charitable income, our charitable giving, almost as if that's God's cut. And the rest we can do the rest with what we want. We want to challenge people to think about using all of their money as being surrendered to God, and look at the power that your investable money, you're in your IRA and your bank accounts and your stocks, wherever they are, and how that can actually also change the world. And there's an opportunity here for the developing world in this now trough that we're seeing in charitable giving or foreign aid. There's an opportunity to really help these countries move ever more to market-based solutions to poverty, which we are convinced are far more efficacious than just aid. The country that has received more aid than any other in the world, Haiti. How's Haiti doing today? Right? And so even though we're all for aid, we're all for charitable giving, we think that we'd be remiss as Christians if we don't think about the important role of profit and for-profit businesses in helping ennoble and lift up the lives of the poor.
So, Bill, you're talking about the concept of impact investing, right? Where we're actually investing our assets, not just our charitable giving that is either, for Christians should be 10%, but is less for most Christians. You're saying, look, you have a much larger pie of financial assets that can be deployed into things like Masaka Farms that you've been talking about. Dana, I want to ask you, how does somebody get started in impact investing? That feel like a new thing for many people that they haven't considered. You work at an impact foundation, which I think, as I understand it, tries to help people get into this. Talk about the practicalities of dipping your toes into impact investing.
Sure.
That is,
Sure.
doing good in the world.
Yes, happy to. So impact investing is thinking about your charitable dollar. With Impact Foundation, you can give your money and make your tax deductible donation. But instead of, like most donor advised funds, just sending that on to a nonprofit, in Impact Foundation, you can then send it and invest it in a transformational company. And you can do it in anything up to market rate. Like it could be for market rate businesses around the world. It could be for what we call concessional. So maybe in a hard to reach place and the business environment is really tough. You want to lift those companies up and help them to grow and eventually get on their own feet. So you might give them a lower loan or something, but you can do that within the Impact Foundation, and it's a donor advised fund designed specifically to help you get equity or debt or revenue share in companies around the world. So when that company pays you back into your donor advised fund, it's still in the charitable realm. You don't get it back in your own pocket, but it's like the goose that lays the golden egg, or like endowments, right? You bring money back in and then you can send it back out. So it's recycling your impact. And also what I would say is investing in businesses that are contributing to flourishing around the world are more scalable and more sustainable oftentimes. So they can be close to the problem and can maybe even provide a better, more sustainable solution over time, so that you don't have to address that problem in the future through non-profits or through government.
Can you give another example of that? I mean, it sounds like Masaka Farms is one example of that. Do you have another example from your book that shows this kind of sustainable, virtuous cycle of recycling that you're talking about?
So let me tell the story of Scott Friesen, a very successful business person, had made all the money he needed to make by his mid-30s and thought he would go retire and then just work for nonprofits. But God said, I've given you these business skills to help people around the world. And he even heard the Lord say, continue to work so that others may live. which I told him when I heard that. I said, I'm so jealous of that tagline. That is so awesome. So he did not retire. He actually then devoted all of his resources towards helping bring redemptive and ethical investment to Africa. And he's doing it in a way that is not concessionary. It's not lower than market rate. He's trying to bring in all kinds of investment dollars to the African markets so that their businesses can thrive, grow, and produce jobs, so people can then provide for their own kids' education and healthcare and new and better housing. And he's got $250 million that he's driven towards Africa now, with thousands of good, dignified jobs. They also really work with training so that they're transferring skills to local people. So I would say he's one of my heroes of really thinking that he's stewarding the master's resources and finds such joy and great relationships as well.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that, Dana. I want to conclude by asking Bill a spiritual and financial issue that I think is in play here as a very serious potential obstacle to the vision of stewardship. And that spiritual and financial issue is called retirement.
Mm-hmm.
Because really, actually, that is where most people's assets are actually stored. And we're talking about freeing up more financial assets of Christians to deploy either into giving or into impact investing. A bulk of that is devoted to retirement. And it's, I think, especially true as you get into your 50s and 60s. You get into this period where you actually are earning more than you ever have in your life, but you also feel an increasing pressure to put and sock away more for your retirement. And it's natural, I think, to think, well, every dollar that I give away or I put into a highly risky investment is a dollar not earning tried and true, reliable returns for my retirement. So, Bill, I want you to tackle this head on, because I think it's a huge issue. How should Christians approach retirement?
It's such a good question. Look, I just warn people, I'm taking a shot at a sacred cow here. Dana and I do that in our book, because I think the American dream is work until you get into your early 60s and then retire to the golf course or the swimming pool or the tennis courts or whatever, and just become kind of self-indulgent. And like, now it's all about me. I've worked hard and now I get to rest.
Right.
We think that's unbiblical. We think that we are made to work, that we worked before the fall, that work wasn't a result of the fall in the garden. We're going to work in heaven. God works. We want to be like God. Work is essential to a flourishing life. Studies have shown when you retire, people often wither. We've seen this in many people's lives, and you just start getting cranky old guys yelling at kids to stay off their lawn. And we want to challenge people to think differently. Now, some people are called to stop working for pay, but it doesn't mean you should stop working. You should be every day getting up and saying, I got a job to do outside of the Sabbath. What's my job today? And you serve the Lord every day and you're doing that. But we also want to encourage people to say, why not keep working? When you hit your finish line, when you're like, okay, I can retire, we have enough money. And first of all, be sure that you do have enough money. So work with a financial advisor to make sure you're not kidding yourself. But then when you get to that place when you say, we got enough, why not just keep on working for pay and give away all of your net income? Everything you make after taxes, just give it away. Do it for 1 year. And then see if you don't want to do it a second year and a third year, because you're going to be writing some really big checks to some great ministries. And you might just get addicted to that and thinking like, yeah, this is enough money. And the best time to hit a finish line is before you hit the finish line. In other words, decide ahead of time how much is enough. There's some people who hit their finish line by saying, look, I'm a doctor, but I could live on a nurse's salary. Lots of other nurses do that. I'm going to give away the differential between what I make as a doctor and what I would make as a nurse. I'll just give away that differential. The point is, we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world. If you make the median family income of $74,000 in the US, you're among the richest people in the world. With great power comes great responsibility. To quote Spider-Man, who is paraphrasing Jesus, to him who has been given much, much
The
has been
gospel
expected.
according to Stan Lee, you're quoting here.
Exactly. Yeah. With whom I had lunch in the White House when I worked
So
in the
wait,
White
let
House.
me interrupt here for a second. That you are taking a shot at a sacred cow hill. Dana and Bill, are you guys planning to live this way? Or is this your vision for your retirement?
We already do. Go ahead, Dana.
We do. About 5 years ago, we started this question of how much is enough. And although it was scary, it really exposed some areas where I was not trusting the Lord. And we decided with good counsel, wise, godly counsel, we were able to pick what would be enough. And then once we hit that, we now do give away 100% of everything we earn.
Wow.
So, and it has been joyful. And in fact, I would say it has been, I've had less anxiety around money. I've had more peace. I've had more intimacy with the Lord. And those were things we found throughout of all the 24 individuals that we interviewed for our book, that they had so many of those benefits of peace, joy, relational richness, and intimacy with the Lord. So it's kind of that upside down kingdom. It's not what you expect, but over time, that's what you find. It is better to
this
give
is
than
this is a
receive.
challenge, I think, to many of our listeners. It's one that we should weigh. It's a challenge to me personally. As somebody who we give, we give substantial amounts, but we are not hitting the target that you're talking about. So that's very humbling for me to hear that vision. But thank you for sharing it. I think when I reflect on it theologically, it really gets down to what do we think is the end of our life. By end, I mean, the telos, the purpose, the end drive. Is it really to have as comfortable of a retirement as possible? Or do we believe that the end is Jesus' end? And part of that end is he will return. And scripture is very clear. He comes to, and as part of that final return to earth, there is a final judgment that he will actually ask, what have we done with our lives and money? And that is part of the end that we're all shooting for. And it's a challenge to us all to think about how we can meet that day with our financial resources as stewards, not owners. It's a title of the book by Dana and Bill Wichterman. Dana and Bill, thank you so much for coming on the Good Faith Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Curtis.
All right, listeners, thank you for joining us. And we'll continue to be tackling these hard issues in a moment when Christians are going to be challenged, perhaps to really think through and even change different parts of our lives in response to this moment. So join us next week as we once again gather around the campfire.